the Godot BootCamp lesson on creating user entities. In this lesson, we'll be using user entities to store the user's progress in the example game's horde mode. In the example game, the first thing that we need to do is to determine if the user has already created a user entity to store the data. To do that, we'll use the getEnitiesByType request. For this request, we need to supply the entity type as the parameter. In the event that this request returns an empty entities array, that means that the user does not have a user entity for the supplied entity type parameter. Click the JSON response. Notice the entities array. If the array contains data, then the user entity has already been created. But if it's empty, then we'll need to use the createEntity request to create the entity programmatically from the example game. The createEntity request takes in the following parameters: the entity type, the initial data, and the entity's ACL. Click the JSON response to familiarize yourself with the data the request will return on a successful response. Open Visual Studio Code. At the top, click File, then New Text File. Click Select a language, then click C#. Save the file and name it userprogress.cs. At the top, declare the using statement. Then declare a public class called userProgress. Declare 6 private member variables. 2 of the variables are strings to represent the entity ID and the entity type. The other 4 variables are bools to keep track of which level is completed. I realized that a single int variable here would have sufficed, but I wanted to demonstrate saving multiple points of data to a user entity. Declare a public default constructor and initialize the member variables. Declare an overloaded public constructor that takes in the entity ID and the entity type as the parameters. In the constructor's body, initialize the member variables. Declare a read-only property for the entity ID and the entity type. Declare a public property that returns the formatted JSON data. Finally, declare a public property for each of the bool member variables. Save the file and then navigate to the constants.cs file. Declare 3 public constants. The first one will represent the entity's type. The second constant will represent the default user entity data. We'll pass this data on as an argument for the createEntity request. The third constant will represent the entity's default ACL. We'll also pass this in as an argument on the createEntity request. Save the file and then navigate to the network.cs file. Declare 4 public delegates, 2 to handle the response of a getEnitiesByType request and 2 to handle the response of the createEntity request. Scroll down to the bottom. Above the output log method, declare a private method called parseUserProgress. This method takes in a reference to the user entity dictionary. In the body of the method, get the data dictionary from the user entity dictionary. Parse the entity ID and the entity type. Create the userProgress object, passing in the entity ID and the entity type as the arguments. Then parse the 4 bool values from the data dictionary. Return the userProgress object. Scroll up and find the award achievements request. Below it, declare a public method called requestUserProgressData. In the body, check to see if the user is authenticated. If the user is not authenticated, format an error message and then invoke the handleRequestError method, passing in the error message and the error delegate as the arguments. If the user is authenticated, declare success callback lambda. In the body of the lambda, log the response data. Deserialize the JSON response data into a dictionary called response. Parse the data dictionary from the response dictionary. Get the entities array from the data dictionary. Declare a userProgress variable and assign null to it. Then check if there are any elements in the entities array. If there are any elements in the array, get the entity data for the first element. Invoke the parse user progress method, pass in a reference to the entity data, and store the method's result in the user progress variable. If the success callback delegate is not null, it will be invoked. Pass in the user progress object as the argument. Next, declare failure callback lambda. In the body of the lambda, format an error message. Then invoke the handle request error method, pass in an error message and the error delegate in as the arguments. Invoke brainCloud's entity services get entities by type request, pass in the entity type constant and the success and failure callback lambdas as the arguments. Next, declare a public method called create user progress data. In the body, check to see if the user is authenticated. If the user is not authenticated, format an error message and then invoke the handle request error method, pass in the error message and the error delegate as the arguments. If the user is authenticated, declare success callback lambda. In the body of the lambda, log the response data. If the callback delegate is not null, it will be invoked. Next, declare failure callback lambda. In the body of the lambda, format an error message. And then invoke the handle request error method, pass in an error message and the error delegate as the arguments. Invoke brainCloud's entity services create entity request, pass in the entity type constant, the initial data constant, the ACL constant, and the success and failure callback lambdas as the arguments. Save the file and then navigate to the game.cs file. Declare a private member variable of type user progress and instantiate it. Scroll down. Below the onAuthentication request failed method, declare a public method called getUserProgress. In the body, return the user progress object. Scroll down to the bottom. Declare a private method called onUserProgress data request completed. In the body, check to see if the user progress parameter is not null. If it's not null, then assign the parameter to the user progress member variable. If the user data parameter is null, then invoke the network's create user progress data method. Scroll up and find the onAuthentication request completed method. Invoke the network's request user progress data method, pass in the onUserProgress data request completed method in as the argument. Save the file and then navigate to the level select dialog.cs file. Override the onShow method. In the body, set the buttons for level 2, 3, and boss to be disabled if the corresponding user progress data for that level is false. For instance, all the buttons except for level 1 will be disabled on startup. If the user beats level 1, then level 2 will be available, and so on. Save the file and then compile the code. If the code compiles successfully, open Godot. Run the game. Click Horde Mode. Notice that the buttons for the last 3 levels are disabled. Stop the game. In the output window, notice we had a create entity request. That is because the entities array for the get entities by type request was empty. Run the game again. In the output window, notice there isn't a create entity request. That's because in the last session a moment ago, we invoked the create entity request and populated the user's entity with data. As a result, notice that the user entities array in the get entities by type request was not empty. Updating user entities is the next lesson in the Godot BootCamp.